Hello, everybody. This video provides an overview of the Canterbury Tales and focuses on the prologue of the Canterbury Tales. In Beowulf and Everyman, there is one model of how to live and how to die, and everyone is judged as heroic or craven in regard to how closely they manage to live or die up to this standard. In fact, one could argue that there is a close relationship between these poets' emphasis on the overweening conquest of death and their characterization of human reality as one-dimensional and rules-based. As any zoologist knows, life is characterized by its teeming diversity, the diversity of life forms, the diversity across life forms, as well as the diversity within species. Life is all about difference and dialogue and cooperation and competition and networks of interlaced perspectives bouncing off one another and weaving themselves into the rich and ever-changing tapestry that constitutes the upsurge of life on Earth. Death is simple. All dead things share a similar thermodynamic condition. If death reigns supreme, then all of this chaotic mishigas of individuals and their messy personalities and emotions and perspectives is sinful dreck that needs to be purged and purified by death's holy supremacy. But if life is really in charge, and in a lot of ways it is easy to see that it is, then true holiness lies in the variety and peculiarity of individual human beings, the ways of life they follow, the beliefs they hold, the stories they tell. Geoffrey Chaucer's contribution to world literature is that he was the earliest influential English writer to embrace life. He learned it from the Italians, Boccaccio and Dante. They showed him that the most charming, complex, and intriguing thing in the universe is a simple human being, the way they live their life, the way they perceive the world around them, the way they express themselves. Any given human being presents a complexity and significance that eclipses all the philosophy of all the sages in the universe. It's not just sentimental hogwash either. It's based on neurology and math. A human being is a complex of trillions of synaptic connections with a unique, unprecedented, and unreplicatable network of ideas and emotions. An idea by itself, by contrast, is just a few sentences in a book or a deliberately dumbed-down simplification or whatever. Protagoras said, "Man is the measure of all things. The great mysteries of the universe are not in the past, or in heaven, or in some secret body of arcane teachings. They are right here, implicit in the goofy doings of this rabble of eccentrics that you happen to be thrown together with in your pilgrimage through life." The next time you're in a restaurant, look around at the other customers. What kinds of people are they? What kinds of stories do they have to tell? Consider the strangeness of the fact that all these people are in the same restaurant, but at the same time, they're also each inhabiting a separate universe, a life world, grounded in the way they see reality from their own subjective point of view. This thought experiment is a miniature version of the world at large, and it is the starting point for Chaucer's masterpiece, the Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales is a collection of 24 stories, each told by a different pilgrim on the way from Suffolk to Canterbury. In the famous opening lines of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales, the narrator describes how medieval Europeans embarked on pilgrimages as a way of getting out and enjoying the spring weather. We'll be reading the Canterbury Tales in a translation from Middle to Modern English, but it is a time-honored precedent that an English teacher teaching the Canterbury Tales has to pretend to know how to recite the opening lines of the prologue in Middle English. So here goes. On April with his chalets suite, the drought of March hath pierced into the rote, and by the every vein in such liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur, yada yada yada, than longen folk doon pilgrimages. Chaucer's starting point for the poem is the rebirth of nature in the spring, the natural upsurge of plant and animal life that represents a vital force surging through the cosmos, and human beings travel on pilgrimages not only or even primarily for religious purposes. Canterbury Cathedral is the site of a shrine dedicated to the medieval martyr St. Thomas Becket, but as a way of responding to nature's life energies. The narrator is part of this human community of pilgrims. He and 29 other pilgrims have gathered at the Tabard Inn on the evening before their departure, and he devotes the bulk of the prologue to providing brief verbal sketches of his companions. Unlike the allegorical figures in Everyman, the characters Chaucer describes are fully human. Their clothes, their mannerisms, their ways of expressing themselves all emphasize their individuality and unique personalities. The specific details Chaucer mentions regarding each character's appearance and behavior, some of which are likely obscure to modern readers, are intended to show that this particular knight or monk or miller or whatever is different from every other knight or monk or miller or whatever. Indeed, sometimes Chaucer's sketches of the pilgrims hew closely to stereotype. Some characters, specifically the knight, the nun, and the Oxford cleric, are described as being perfect representations of their type, which may even make them seem to have something in common with fellowship, the archetypal false friend in every man. Other figures, notably the monk, the friar, and the wife of Bath, are described in terms of the way they deviate from the behavior one would stereotypically associate with their identities. In fact, one could probably score each of the characters introduced in the prologue on a scale of whether they adhere more or less faithfully to their stereotypes, which suggests another level of diversity and variety. Not only are the characters a mixed bag of types, but they each have their own way of being the type of person they are. Yet another level of variety is introduced by the narrator's own attitude toward the individuals he describes. One could also develop some kind of scale to score all of Chaucer's sketches in the prologue in terms of how much he admires the people he is describing and the degree to which he quietly satirizes them. In a lesser work, it would be easy to imagine a similar series of sketches where every social type was praised as being the perfect example of the kind of person they are, or another example in which every social type was roundly mocked and satirized as a hypocrite and a buffoon. But Chaucer's artistry is much more subtle. In Chaucer's prologue, each of the pilgrims receives a unique treatment as the individuals they are, in terms of the relationship between their individuality and their typicality, and in the way Chaucer thinks about them, the degree to which they are treated as subjects of satire. But another important aspect of Chaucer's humanism is that even when he pokes fun at his subjects, he is not moralistic or judgmental. When he describes how the friar makes a living by manipulating poor people into giving him money, or how the miller has developed a superpower for knowing exactly how much he can cheat a customer before he gets discovered, or how the summoner extorts money out of people by blackmail, his tone is consistently light-hearted and observational. It is as if Chaucer admires the variety of good and bad among his fellow pilgrims in the same spirit with which he celebrates other kinds of differences. In the same way that human reality encompasses many different professions, it also encompasses both good and bad people, and Chaucer is more interested in remarking on this variety than in trying to say that everyone should behave according to some abstract moral system. The Bible says that God showers rain on the good and bad alike, and you could say that Chaucer takes a similar approach to the way he thinks about his characters, establishing a scientific approach to human reality that anticipates the perspective that the first psychologists would apply to the study of human beings in the late 19th century. After talking us through a number of these sketches of late medieval characters, Chaucer describes the host, the man who owns the Tabard Inn, who is a jolly and sociable person, in line with the stereotype of what you might expect from an innkeeper, but also full of individuality and uniqueness. The host, will later learn that his name is Harry Bailey, sets up the premise of the rest of the work, which is that each of the 30 pilgrims will tell 2 stories on the way to Canterbury and 2 stories on the way back, a plan which, if followed through on, would have resulted in 120 tales. The version we have only has 24 tales, either because Chaucer never intended to write all of them, or because he lost interest in the project, or because he died. The host nominates himself as the judge who will determine which pilgrim will win the award for best tale. The storytelling premise is one that Chaucer learned from Boccaccio's The Decameron, but Chaucer ties the tales to the speakers in a way that Boccaccio had not done. As Chaucer's pilgrims tell their stories, we are invited to hear the stories not just as free-floating narratives, but as representations of the way this individual storyteller perceives the world around them. Sometimes this connection is very obvious, as when the knight tells a story of courtly love and martial valor, or when the wife of Bath tells a story about a man tasked with trying to understand what women want. Other times, the connection is more obscure, but the result is always that we are reminded that narratives are not just a form of entertainment, although they certainly can be that too. They are a way that people explain the world to themselves. Stories, in this sense, are always embedded in other stories. They always exist in tension with other stories and other ways of telling the same stories. Many of the stories told in the Canterbury Tales are retellings of other stories or conglomerations of different narrative traditions and genres. In some cases, different stories in the Canterbury Tales seem to be in dialogue with one another, reformulating previous themes into new configurations, or even rebutting the worldview implicit in one story with a contrasting narrative. And of course, as I just said, the whole book is Chaucer's retelling of the Decameron. The stories are also grounded in the social class, the personal biases, the modes of self-expression, and the unique identities of the people telling the stories, so that you understand the meaning of the story in part through the character of the storyteller, and likewise understand the character of the storyteller through the story they tell and the way they tell it. In this sense, Chaucer's breakthrough in the Canterbury Tales is to create a work of fiction that absorbs the complexity of the human uses of fiction itself. The way that the stories that human beings tell are always actually stories about the storytellers themselves, even as these stories help to inform the ways we see each other and the ways we understand ourselves. Moreover, the host's storytelling game draws us into the action as well. With the host's suggestion that the pilgrims' stories will be judged and that a best story winner will be chosen, the reader is invited to read the stories with an eye on the question of what makes a good story. Inevitably, this question requires us to draw on our own storytelling preferences, the genres and plots that resonate with us personally. And these qualities, we might come to realize on some level, are just as connected to our role in society, as well as to our unique ways of inhabiting that role, just as the knight's profession makes him partial to tales of courtly love and martial rivalry. In this sense, we might start to see ourselves as denizens of the Tabard Inn, turning Chaucer's keen eye and open heart on our own appearance, behavior, and modes of being in the world. Maybe if Chaucer had ever finished his epic plan for this collection of stories, he would have included an epilogue where the host would choose a winner. As it stands, we are left to try to judge the storytelling competition ourselves, foregrounding the sense in which our response to each of these stories is actually a reflection of our own identity and our own personality. We are fellow pilgrims in Chaucer's retinue, traveling through the infinite maze of interwoven stories that make up our society and even our reality itself.